The Mafia Boss's man had perfect fake documents. The chubby airport officer stopped him anyway. She didn't know she'd just saved everything. The documents were perfect. That was the first thing Natasha Reims noticed, and it was the thing that stopped her. In 8 years of working passport control at O'Hare International Airport, she had developed a relationship with imperfection that most people would not have understood if she tried to explain it. An understanding of the specific, reliable way that genuine documents were imperfect. The microscopic variations in printing pressure and laminate adhesion and photo alignment that accumulated across millions of real documents produced by real government processes operating at scale. Variations so small that no individual examiner would have consciously registered any one of them, but that combined, across thousands of documents handled over years, into a pattern her hands and her eyes knew the way a musician's hands knew the particular feel of their own instrument.
Real documents had a quality that she could not fully articulate, and did not need to articulate, because her hands recognized it before her conscious mind did. The way you recognize a familiar voice in a room before you turn to look. The man in the expensive suit had a passport that her hands did not recognize. It was perfect. It was exactly the right weight, exactly the right texture, exactly the right color. The photo matched the face. The hologram caught the light correctly. The machine read it without error. Every visible data point was correct, and her hands, which had handled more than 1 million documents in 8 years, knew something was wrong before she could say what. She stopped him. She did this with the same economy of motion and expression she brought to every stop, the specific, practiced quality of a professional action that had been performed many times and did not require performance to be performed. She said, "I'd like to have a second look at your documents, sir." She said it in the register of someone stating a procedural requirement, rather than making an accusation. She held out her hand. He gave her the passport a second time, and she held it, and she looked at it, and her hands confirmed what her hands had told her the first time. She stopped him. Her supervisor was not pleased. The line was long. It was a Friday evening. The departure terminal was at capacity, and the man in the expensive suit had not raised his voice or made any unusual movement or produced any behavior that a supervisor reviewing camera footage would have flagged as suspicious. He had simply been stopped by an officer who could not explain, in terms that satisfied the supervisor's need for a documentable reason, why she was stopping him. She had said, "Something is wrong with the documents." The supervisor had said, "The machine cleared them." She had said, "I know." The supervisor had said, "Then what exactly is the issue?" She had said, "I need secondary screening." The supervisor had looked at the line, at the man in the expensive suit who was standing with the specific, practiced calm of someone who had prepared for exactly this possibility, and had made the decision that her 8 years and her track record warranted. Secondary screening found a data storage device hidden in the heel of the man's left shoe. She had, in the 3 minutes between her request for secondary screening and the supervisor's authorization, been aware of Varro watching her with the specific quality of attention of someone who is calculating. Not worried, calculating. The distinction was important, and she had noted it with the clinical detachment of someone filing information for later use. A genuinely innocent person stopped at document control produced a specific behavioral signature, varying proportions of confusion, mild annoyance, and a particular quality of cooperative compliance that came from the understanding that protesting was both pointless and counterproductive. What Varro had produced was something different, the specific, controlled stillness of someone who had prepared for this possibility and was running through contingencies, and who understood that his best option was to continue performing calm so convincingly that the performance itself might carry him through. It had not carried him through. Secondary screening found a data storage device hidden in the heel of the man's left shoe.
The device was encrypted. The encryption was sophisticated enough that it required federal intervention to break. This would take 72 hours. In those 72 hours, Natasha completed 2 more shifts, processed approximately 960 passengers, flagged 2 for secondary screening for reasons unrelated to the Varro case, and did not think extensively about what was on the device, because what was on the device was not her department. Her department had been the stopping. Everything after the stopping was someone else's. She would learn much later, and through indirect channels, that the 72 hours of decryption had produced something that caused the lead federal investigator on the case to make 3 phone calls in rapid succession and to request, within the hour, a briefing from his supervisor's supervisor. She would learn this, and she would file it in the same interior category where she filed the other things she had learned about the scope of what the Friday evening had prevented, and she would not discuss it with anyone, because discretion was structural for her in a way that was not effortful, and because the full shape of what had happened was not her story to tell. The device was encrypted. The encryption was sophisticated enough that it required federal intervention to break.
What was on the device, when it was broken, was the complete operational architecture of one of the most significant criminal organizations operating in the greater Chicago area. Names, financial structures, routes, contacts, the specific internal geography of an organization that had survived for 3 generations precisely because this information had never existed in any form that could be extracted from it and delivered to the people who would benefit most from having it. Natasha Reims did not know any of this on the Friday evening when she stopped the man with the perfect documents. She knew only that something was wrong, and that her job was to find out what. She had found out what. She had written her report and gone home at the end of her shift and slept without difficulty, because she had done her job, and her job was done. She did not know that 6 blocks away, in a building she had never entered and whose address she did not know, a man named Lorenzo Falcone was making phone calls that would not stop until he understood exactly who had been standing at that passport control desk on a Friday evening at O'Hare International Airport. Natasha Elaine Reims had been born and raised in Pilsen, the daughter of a Mexican-American father who drove a delivery truck and a Puerto Rican mother who worked as a medical receptionist in a household where the specific, practical intelligence of working people, the intelligence of people who paid attention to their environment because their environment required it, not because they had been taught to in any formal sense, had been as present and as unremarkable as the furniture. She was 32 years old. She was 5'5" and 235 pounds, with the specific, solid build of someone whose body had always prioritized function over form, and who had made peace with this reality early enough that it had never constituted a significant, ongoing negotiation. She had been, in her teenage years, an athlete. Soccer, 4 years of it through high school and 2 years of community college, not competitive in the sense of championships or recruitment, but consistent in the sense of showing up and working and developing the specific, reliable physical confidence of someone who has moved their body purposefully and repeatedly for long enough that the body has become a thing they trust. She had stopped playing when the schedule of her adult life had stopped accommodating it, and she had replaced it with long walks and the sustained physical presence that her job required. 8 hours standing, attention intact, the kind of endurance that was not dramatic, but was real. Her body had, across 32 years, reliably done what she asked of it. She asked it to be present, to be alert, to sustain a quality of attention through a long shift and beyond. It had always complied. She was 32 years old. She was 5'5" and 235 pounds, with the specific solid build of someone whose body was organized around endurance rather than appearance.
and she wore her dark hair in a tight bun when she was working because it was practical, and she wore her uniform with the precise, unremarkable correctness of someone who understood that her authority derived from competence and not from how she looked in the clothes that represented it. She had no particular interest in how she looked in the clothes. She had a significant interest in what she was doing in them. She had come to border protection through the specific, unglamorous route of someone who had applied for a federal position because federal positions offered stability and benefits. She was the first person in her immediate family to hold a federal job. Her father had driven his delivery truck for 22 years without benefits. Her mother had worked the receptionist desk for a medical practice that had twice reduced its staff without reducing its hours for the remaining employees. And the stability of what she had found was not something she took for granted or had stopped noticing. She showed up for every shift. She did the full work. She did not manage her energy in reserve for some future deployment. She understood, in the specific, practical way of a person whose family had operated without safety nets, that the thing you had was the thing you currently had, and that the way to keep it was to deserve it continuously rather than periodically. She had come to border protection through the specific, unglamorous route of someone who had applied for a federal position because federal positions offered stability and benefits and a career structure that her family's particular economic history made considerably more appealing than the alternatives. She had not arrived with a vocation for document examination or a childhood interest in security work. She had arrived with the qualities that her supervisors had recognized within her first year and that had shaped the subsequent 7: patience, attention, and the specific, unglamorous intellectual discipline of someone who is willing to be wrong and to learn from being wrong with the same thoroughness they brought to being right. The document work had found her rather than the other way around. She had discovered in her first year that she had an aptitude for the specific kind of pattern recognition the work required, not the dramatic, intuitive pattern recognition of detective fiction, but the quiet, cumulative, data-intensive pattern recognition of someone who handled the same category of object thousands of times and developed, through sheer volume of exposure, an interior model of what normal looked like that was detailed enough to register deviation before the deviation was consciously visible. She had refined this aptitude through 8 years of deliberate practice, in the specific way that any skill was refined through deliberate practice, by paying attention to the instances when she was wrong and understanding why, by maintaining an active interest in the technical literature on document fraud and authentication, by developing relationships with the forensic document examiners who worked at the federal level and who had, over time, become colleagues she called when a question was beyond her own expertise. She was not the best document examiner in the federal system. She was, in the specific context of a busy international airport on a Friday evening, with a line of several hundred passengers and a supervisor looking at the clock, almost certainly one of the most practically effective. She did not think of herself in these terms. She thought of herself as someone who had a job that she did carefully, and she went to work, and she did it, and she went home. And this cycle had repeated for 8 years with the specific, unspectacular consistency of a person whose professional identity did not require external validation to sustain itself. On the Friday evening in November, when she stopped the man with the perfect documents, she had been on shift for 6 hours and had processed approximately 480 passengers, and the man in the expensive suit was the 481st. She had not been looking for him specifically. She had been looking at everyone specifically, which was the same thing practiced at a different scale. The man's name, she learned later, was Daniel Varro. She learned it not from the federal investigators directly, but from the specific, ambient process by which information circulated in a federal building after a significant arrest, the way a case developed a presence in the building's conversational atmosphere, became a reference point in hallway conversations, was mentioned in the shorthand of colleagues who shared a professional world. She learned it without seeking it, the way you learned most things in an institutional environment, by being present and paying attention. The man's name, she learned later, was Daniel Varro. He was 43 years old, Hungarian-American, and had worked within the operational structure of the Falcone organization for 14 years, during which time he had occupied a position of sufficient trust and proximity to have accumulated, through years of careful, patient, entirely covert collection, the specific body of information that the device in his shoe contained.
He had been, for at least 3 years by the federal investigators' estimation, and possibly longer, employed simultaneously by the Falcone organization and by a competing interest that had invested significantly in acquiring exactly the information Varro was carrying. The documents he had been carrying were, as Lorenzo Falcone would later tell Natasha, with the specific, controlled flatness of a man describing something that still unsettled him, among the finest forgeries produced in the previous decade, the product of a counterfeiting operation that had successfully passed documents through federal screening at multiple major airports on multiple prior occasions. The $500,000 figure he would also provide was not an exaggeration. The people who had wanted Varro out of the country and his cargo delivered had invested considerably in ensuring that no airport document examiner would stop him. They had not anticipated Natasha Reims. She had given her statement to the FBI on the Monday following the Friday, in a conference room at the federal building downtown, to a pair of investigators who were professionally courteous and whose questions revealed, obliquely but legibly to someone paying attention, the specific quality of their interest in what she had noticed and how. They wanted to understand the mechanism. They had, she sensed, encountered other document examiners who had flagged unusual documents and had explained their reasoning in terms of technical characteristics, misaligned microprinting, anomalous hologram refraction, substrate inconsistencies. They had not, she sensed, encountered someone whose explanation was going to be what hers was going to be. She told them what she had noticed. The angle at which Varro had presented the document, which was marginally off from the natural angle of someone whose relationship to the document was simply one of ownership. The angle was slightly too controlled, as though the presentation had been practiced, and the practice had not fully absorbed the unconsidered naturalness of habit. The micropause before he answered the standard question about his destination, not a pause that would have registered as unusual in any individual interaction, but a pause that, in the context of the specific tempo of the hundreds of interactions she had conducted that day, was approximately 1/2 second longer than the average response time for that question. The quality of his gaze, direct, maintained, calibrated to approximate the casual confidence of someone with nothing to hide, which was itself a tell, because genuine confidence in a routine interaction did not calibrate itself. It simply was. The federal investigator had listened to all of this and then asked, with the specific courtesy of someone trying not to reveal how significant they found the answer, "How did you learn to notice these things?" She had said, 8 years, 3,000 faces a week. I stopped keeping track of the exact number a long time ago. The investigator had pushed slightly on this. He had said, other officers have 8 years and similar volumes. He had said it carefully, not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry, the question of someone who was trying to understand a variable that their current framework didn't fully account for. She had thought about how to answer this. She had said, I think the difference is what you do with the volume. You can process 3,000 faces a week and learn to process them faster. Or you can process 3,000 faces a week and learn to read them better. Those produce different results. I've spent 8 years trying to do the second thing. He had written this down. She could tell from the specific quality of his attention while he wrote it that he was not writing it as a formality, but as something he intended to return to. She had signed her statement and gone back to work. She had said,
8 years, 3,000 faces a week. I stopped keeping track of the exact number a long time ago. He had said, but other officers process similar volumes and don't identify this type of anomaly at this rate. She had said, I pay attention. Some people process volume. I process volume and pay attention. Those aren't the same thing. He had written this down. She had signed her statement and gone back to work.
If you need to know how Lorenzo Falcone found out it was her, how a man who controlled one of the most significant organizations in Chicago traced the identity of an airport passport control officer from a federal building's public records to a name and a shift schedule, then you need to stay with this story. Because the conversation that happened at the end of her shift on a Tuesday 3 weeks later is the conversation that neither of them had planned for and that neither of them would forget. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell. The story is not over. The days after the arrest had a specific quality for Natasha. Not dramatic, not exceptional, but charged with the particular quiet awareness of someone who has done something significant and is waiting to find out how significant. She completed her shifts. She processed her passengers. She wrote her reports. She did all of this with the same thoroughness as always, and the thoroughness felt, if anything, more deliberate in those days, as though she were performing, for no audience, a demonstration of the thing that had led to what had happened, the thing that was not exceptional or heroic, but simply a way of doing her job that she had decided to sustain. She had been asked by 2 colleagues who had heard fragments of what had happened whether she was nervous. She had said, "About what?" They had looked at her. She had understood what they meant and had thought about it honestly before answering. She had said, "If I stopped the wrong person, I'd be nervous. I stopped the right person. The thing that makes me nervous is whether the next one will be as visible." This was the accurate answer. The secondary anxiety, the anxiety about what the person she had stopped represented, about the organizational forces that might or might not be interested in her as a loose end, was a real anxiety. But it was an anxiety about a variable she could not control, and she had spent 8 years understanding that the variables you could not control were variables you did not spend your attention on. Lorenzo Falcone had known about Varro's arrest within 4 hours of it happening, through channels that were reliable and that he was not going to describe to anyone outside his most immediate circle. What he had not known in those first hours was the specific mechanism of the arrest, not how Varro had been stopped, but by whom and on the basis of what. This question had occupied him with an intensity that surprised even him. He had managed the internal consequences of Varro's betrayal with the efficient, comprehensive attention his position required, had made the necessary decisions about structure and personnel and exposure, had conducted the assessments of damage and the analyses of what remained secure, had handled the human dimensions of a significant organizational betrayal with the specific, deliberate care of someone who understood that how you handled these things determined whether the organization that came out the other side was stronger or weaker than the one that had gone in. He had done all of this well by his own assessment and by the assessments of the people closest to him who could speak to it honestly. What he had not handled, because there was no operational mechanism for handling it, was the specific, persistent quality of his curiosity about the woman at the document control desk. This question had occupied him with an intensity that surprised even him. He was a man who was accustomed to crises, to the specific, concentrated problem-solving mode that emergencies activated. And what he found himself doing in the days following Varro's arrest was not the crisis management he recognized, but something more fundamental. A need to understand what had happened at the document control desk on a Friday evening, which he did not understand, and which he found, in the specific, uncomfortable way of things that resist comprehension, genuinely unsettling.
He knew what Varro had been carrying. He understood the scope of what had been prevented. He had spent the first 48 hours after the arrest managing the internal consequences of what Varro's betrayal revealed, the specific, comprehensive reorganization of an operational structure that had been compromised by a man who had been trusted for 14 years, the assessment of what was now exposed and what remained protected, the decisions about what needed to change and how quickly.
He had done all of this with the complete, methodical efficiency of a man who had built something over 20 years that could withstand significant internal damage and continue to function.
What he had not been able to set aside, even while managing all of this, was the question of who had stopped Varro. The documents had been perfect. He knew this because the people who had produced them were the best available, had successfully moved other documents through federal screening at other airports, and had charged accordingly for the confidence of that track record. He had not chosen the documents himself. The decision to move Varro's extraction through O'Hare had been made by people he had trusted, and they had chosen the documents and the timing with what had seemed at the time like appropriate care. The documents should have passed. They had passed every technical check the system had run on them.
And someone had stopped them anyway, on the basis of something that the federal reports described in the careful, understated language of official documentation as officer discretion based on behavioral indicators. He had read the official documentation 3 times. The official documentation was, as official documentation tended to be, an accurate but incomplete account of what had happened. Accurate in the sense that the facts it contained were correct, incomplete in the sense that it had been produced by a system designed to document what could be documented, and was therefore silent on the things that could not be, which, in this case, included the specific interior mechanism by which Natasha Reims had known what she had known before she could say why she knew it. He had read the documentation and had not found in it what he needed. He had needed to go to the source. He had read the official documentation 3 times. He had not found, in any reading of it, a satisfactory account of what had actually happened. He needed to talk to her. This was not a decision he reached through calculation. It was something closer to the recognition of an inevitability, the specific understanding that there was a question he needed answered, and that the only person who could answer it was the woman who had stopped Varro, and that therefore he needed to be in a room with that person, which meant finding out who she was and how to get into that room. Finding out who she was took his people 11 days. This was not because the information was particularly secure. Airport personnel records were not the most protected category of federal employee information, but because he had insisted on a level of discretion in the acquisition that made faster methods unavailable. He did not want federal attention added to the federal attention already generated by Varro's arrest. He wanted a name, a shift, a face, obtained through means that would not themselves become a problem. He had the name on the 12th day, Natasha Reims. Passport control, Terminal 5, Tuesday through Saturday, 4 to midnight. He went on a Tuesday, at the end of her shift, which he knew from the schedule his people had obtained. He went alone, which was unusual for him in most contexts, but was, in this context, the only way to do what he was doing. A man arriving at a federal building with security personnel was a man drawing attention he did not want to draw. He went through the staff entrance, through the authorization that his people had arranged through channels he was not going to enumerate, and he waited in the restricted area of Terminal 5 for the last 45 minutes of her shift, watching the document control operation from the specific vantage point of someone who had spent 3 weeks trying to understand something and was now watching the thing they had been trying to understand in operation. He watched her work. He had not expected this to be informative, but it was. What he observed in those 45 minutes was not dramatic or exceptional.
It was the ordinary end of an ordinary shift at a busy airport document control station.
But the quality of her attention was visible even from a distance, in the specific way that certain qualities are visible in any person performing their function. The completeness of her focus on each passenger, the specific stillness of her body between interactions that was not inattention, but the particular alertness of someone conserving their attention for the moments it was needed. The way her expression never fully relaxed into the autopilot effect that most people in repetitive jobs developed as a protective measure. She was, he thought, watching the way he watched, completely, from the beginning to the end of each interaction, without reserving any portion of her attention for something else. He went on a Tuesday. The end-of-shift transition at Terminal 5 happened between midnight and 12:15, the specific, unhurried ritual of federal employees completing their documentation and handing off to the next rotation. Natasha had processed her last passenger at 11:53 and was at her station completing the shift log when she became aware of a man standing at the far end of the processing area, past the passenger queue barriers, in the zone that was staff territory rather than public territory, wearing civilian clothes and the specific, contained stillness of someone who was not where he was by accident. She noted him with the peripheral attention she maintained for environmental anomalies and continued her log. She was not alarmed. The terminal security was robust, and he had clearly passed multiple layers of access to be standing where he was, which meant he had legitimate authorization or the kind of unofficial authorization that produced the same practical result. Either way, he was not her immediate problem. She finished her log. She closed her station. She picked up her bag. He crossed to her directly, with the unhurried, direct movement of a man who had decided what he was going to do and was doing it. And he stopped 2 feet from her station, with the specific quality of distance that communicated intention to engage without being threatening about it. He was, she registered this in the automatic way she registered everything, an extremely large man. Not large in the way of someone who had arrived at size accidentally, but large in the specific way of someone whose physical presence was part of the equipment they moved through the world with, broad through the chest and shoulders, dark-haired and going silver at the temples, with a face that was handsome in the way of someone for whom the handsomeness was incidental to the more compelling quality of complete, controlled attentiveness. He was wearing a dark wool coat and no tie, and the specific kind of clothes that were expensive without performing their expense. And he looked at her with the direct, complete attention of a man who had come a specific distance for a specific purpose and was not going to pretend otherwise. He said, "Officer Reyes." She said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Lorenzo Falcone. I believe you stopped one of my employees at this terminal 3 weeks ago." She looked at him. She said, "I stop a significant number of people at this terminal. Can you be more specific?" He said, "Daniel Varro, Friday, November 14th, approximately 8:45 in the evening. Travel documents indicating a Hungarian passport, single carry-on bag, expensive suit." She said, "I remember him." He said, "I would like to understand how you identified him." She said, "That information is part of an active federal investigation and is not something I can discuss with a member of the public." He said, "I understand that. I am not asking you to discuss the investigation. I am asking you to explain to me, in whatever terms you are comfortable with, what you noticed about him." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because his documents were designed by people who are considered among the best in the world at what they do. They have successfully passed those documents through federal document control at 3 other airports in the past 18 months. I need to understand what you saw that those other officers did not." She said, "You need to understand it." He said,
Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She had encountered, across 8 years of federal employment, a significant variety of people who were not what they presented themselves to be, and she had developed, through that exposure, a calibrated sensitivity to the specific texture of authenticity and its absence that was not limited to the documents she examined. She was looking at Lorenzo Falcone, and she was reading him the way she read everything, completely, without rushing toward a conclusion. What she read was not a threat.
It was something more complicated than that. A man who was in genuine distress about something he did not understand, and who had decided, with the specific, direct logic of someone accustomed to finding out things he needed to know, to come to the person who could answer his question and ask her. She said, "The documents were too perfect." He said, "I'm sorry." She paused for a moment. She was deciding, she could tell, not whether to answer, but how to answer, with what level of precision, in what terms. She had described this before to the federal investigators, but she had described it in the careful, bounded language of an official statement, and this was not an official statement, and the man asking her was not asking for the bounded version, but for the real one. She said, "Real documents are imperfect. Not in ways that fail authentication. They pass every check. They're issued by legitimate government processes. They're entirely valid. But the processes that produce them operate at scale, and scale produces variation. The laminate adhesion varies by fractions. The printing pressure varies. The way the photo is seated in the document varies. Real documents have a specific quality that I can't describe in technical terms, because it isn't a technical thing. It's an accumulated pattern that I've built from handling 1 million documents over 8 years. His document didn't have that quality. It was perfect in a way that real documents are not." He looked at her. He said, "That's it." She said, "That's what I noticed first." After that, I watched him. The way he held the document, the timing of his responses, the way he maintained eye contact. All of it was slightly off in the way that a practiced performance is slightly off. Not wrong enough to be obvious, but wrong enough for someone who has been watching real people do the real thing for 8 years. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process this with the complete focused attention she had observed since he walked across the terminal toward her. He said, 3 airports, 3 sets of documents, 3 officers who saw everything you just described and cleared him. She said, "I can't speak to what other officers did or didn't notice." He said, "No, but I can." He said it quietly, without accusation and without drama, with the specific flatness of a man stating a fact he had spent 3 weeks sitting with and had not yet arrived at the end of. She said, "Mr. Falcone, I don't know what relationship you had to the man I stopped or what was on the device he was carrying. Those are matters for the federal investigation and not for this conversation. What I can tell you is what I told the investigators. I noticed something was wrong. I followed procedure, and the secondary screening confirmed the concern. That's the complete description of what happened." He said, "I know. I've read the report." She said, "Then you know what I noticed." He said, "I know what the report says you noticed. I wanted to hear it from you." She looked at him again. She said, "Why does it matter?" He said, "The documents were designed by a specific operation that has produced working documents for 12 years and has never had their work stopped before you stopped it. I want to be precise about what I am telling you. Not stopped and checked. Not stopped, checked, and cleared. Stopped. That has not happened before in 12 years of their operation." She received this information with the same calm she brought to everything. He said,
Because the people who produced those documents have never had their work stopped before. Because there were 4 other people on duty at document control that evening who would have cleared him. Because you were the one who didn't. And I have spent 3 weeks trying to understand why. And the answer you just gave me, that real documents are imperfect and his were too perfect, is the most precise and the most simple answer I have ever received to a question about something I did not understand. He paused. He said, "You saved everything I have spent 20 years building." He said it with the specific, flat weight of a man stating a fact he had been sitting with for 3 weeks and had not yet found a way to diminish or contextualize or make smaller than it was. It was the fact. It was what had happened.
The woman at the document control desk had stopped one man on one evening and, in doing so, had prevented a transfer of information that would have been used in very short order to dismantle the structure of his entire professional life. There was no way to make this smaller. He had stopped trying to. He said, "You saved everything I have spent 20 years building. You did it without knowing what you were saving or what it was. I wanted to look at the person who did that." Natasha held his gaze. She said, "I did my job." He said, "Yes, you did. And I've met many people in my life who were doing their jobs, and very few of them would have stopped him." She said, "Then they weren't paying attention." He said, "No, they weren't." She had, during the course of the conversation, watched his face change. Not dramatically. He was not a man whose face changed dramatically, had clearly spent years developing the specific discipline of a face that communicated what he chose to communicate, and no more. But she was trained in the granular, and the granular changes had been visible to her, if not to the less practiced observer. He had come into the conversation in the controlled, contained mode of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was delivering it. He had left that mode somewhere around the point where she described real documents being imperfect, and what had replaced it was something more open, the specific quality of genuine engagement, the quality that she recognized from the 8,000 people a year who came to her desk with no agenda beyond getting to where they were going, and who showed her their actual faces because there was no reason not to. He had shown her his actual face for the last 20 minutes of the conversation. She had noted this. She was noting it still. The terminal around them had thinned with the end of the shift, other officers completing their transitions, the passenger volume reduced to the trickle of very late arrivals. The fluorescent lights of the document control area were the kind of lights that made everyone look slightly flattened, and in them, Lorenzo Falcone looked neither diminished nor distorted, but simply present, standing 2 feet from her station with the complete, unhurried quality of a man who had finished saying what he came to say and was not yet certain what came next. She said, "Was he working against you?" The man I stopped. He said, "Yes." She said, "For how long?" He said, "We believe at least 3 years, possibly longer." She said, "And you didn't know?" He said, "No." She said, "I'm sorry." He looked at her with something she had not seen in his face before. The specific, fractional relaxation of a man receiving a genuine expression of sympathy from a person who did not owe it to him and was not performing it. He said, "Thank you. That's the first time anyone has said that to me about this." She said, "You're welcome." He said, "Is there anything I can do for you? I don't mean as payment. I mean as the practical acknowledgement that you did something significant without knowing it was significant, and without having any reason to do it other than that it was your job." She said, "My job has a salary and benefits and a pension. I don't need anything additional." He said, "I know. I'm asking anyway." She said,
The thing I need is for people to let me do my job without questioning my reasons when I stop someone. My supervisor questioned my reasons for 3 minutes before authorizing secondary screening. 3 minutes is a long time when someone is trying to board a plane. He looked at her. He said, "That is a remarkably specific answer." She said, "It's the actual answer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will consider whether there are channels through which that concern can be legitimately communicated." She said, "Don't interfere with a federal agency on my behalf. That would create problems I don't need." He said, "I understand the limits." She said, "I hope so." He said, "I do."
I have spent 20 years navigating the limits of what I can and cannot do in relation to federal institutions. I understand them in considerable detail.
She said, "That's an interesting way to describe your relationship to federal law enforcement." He said, "It's an accurate one." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same complete, patient attention he had brought to the entire conversation. He was not performing patience. He was simply patient in the way that people were patient when they had something worth waiting for. He said, "I understand the limits." She said, "I hope so." He said, "I do." The last of the other officers had cleared the station area. The terminal was as close to quiet as an international airport ever became. The ambient, persistent hum of a building that never fully stopped reduced to its lowest register. He said, "Officer Reyes." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to continue this conversation, not here, not in an official context, simply as two people who have something to say to each other." He said it without any of the framing she had half expected, without the framing of obligation, of debt, of the elaborate social contract of powerful men extending invitations to less powerful women who've done them a significant service. He said it as a statement of what he wanted, cleanly, without dressing it in anything else, and she found that the directness of it was itself a kind of data, was itself something her attention had registered and was processing alongside everything else. He said, "I would like to continue this conversation, not here, not in an official context, simply as two people who have something to say to each other." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I'm not sure what we would talk about." He said, "I have a question I haven't asked yet." She said, "What question?" He said, "You described what you noticed about his documents and his behavior. You described it precisely and completely. But I don't think that's the whole answer."
I think there's something before that, something that made you look at him more closely than you looked at the 480 people who came through before him. Something that flagged him before you had processed any of the specific details. She said, "Intuition isn't evidence." He said, "I know. I'm not asking for evidence. I'm asking what you felt in the moment before you started looking for evidence." She was quiet. She said, "Wrong." He said, "Wrong." She said, "He felt wrong. Before I noticed the document, before I started the interaction, in the moment when he stepped to my station, there was something. I can't put it in precise terms, and I know that's not satisfying, but it's accurate. Something in the way he carried himself that was off by a fraction I can't measure. My body noticed it before my brain did." He said, "What did your body notice?" She thought about this seriously. She said, "Preparation. He was prepared. Real travelers are not prepared for document control. They're slightly preoccupied, slightly impatient, slightly distracted by their luggage, or their phones, or their thoughts about wherever they're going. He was none of those things. He was present in a way that people waiting in a queue for 15 minutes are not present. He had been preparing himself for the last 15 minutes, and the preparation was visible if you knew what the absence of preparation looked like. He said, "Wrong." He said, "Wrong." She said, "He felt wrong." Before I could tell you why, that's not a thing I can put in a federal report, and I didn't. But it's what happened. He held her gaze. He said, "In my experience, the people who feel wrong before they can explain why are the people who are paying attention at a level that most people aren't." She said, "Or they're wrong. I've been wrong." He said, "How often?" She said, 8 years, 40,000 passengers a year. I flagged and been wrong 11 times. He said, "And right." She said, "Right enough that the federal investigators called me 3 times after the Varro case to consult on other cases." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression had shifted again, the continuing, patient reassembly of a man's understanding of a situation he had come in thinking he understood, and was discovering he understood less well than he had believed. He said, "Coffee. Not here. Not an official conversation. Coffee as two people who have met under unusual circumstances and have, I think, more to say to each other than we have said." She looked at him. She said, "You know I can't have a relationship with someone under federal investigation." He said, "The investigation cleared me of any direct involvement in Varro's operation. I am not currently a subject of any federal proceeding." She said, "Currently?" He said, "Yes." She held his gaze. She had spent 8 years reading people. She was reading him now with the same complete, unhurried attention she brought to documents. And what she was reading was a man who had told her the truth every time he had said something, who had not performed anything in the course of this conversation, who had come to an airport on a Tuesday night to ask a question he genuinely needed answered, and had asked it without artifice. She said, "Coffee. Once. I'll decide from there." She said it the way she made most decisions, after taking the time the decision required and not more, without performing the deliberation for an audience. She had been reading him throughout the conversation, and what she had read was a man who was not attempting to manage her, was not performing anything, was not using the considerable resources of his position to produce an outcome rather than having a conversation. He had come to an airport on a Tuesday night in civilian clothes, alone, to ask a question he genuinely needed answered. And he had asked it, and she had answered it, and the conversation had found its way to a place that was different from where it had started, in the way that honest conversations sometimes did. She had spent 8 years noticing what was wrong. She had gotten very good at it. She was also, as a necessary counterpart to that skill, fairly good at noticing what was right. She said, "Coffee. Once. I'll decide from there." He said, "That's all I'm asking." She picked up her bag. She walked with him through the terminal toward the exit, through the fluorescent light and the ambient hum of an airport that never fully stopped, past the document control stations and the departure boards and the specific functional architecture of a place designed to manage the movement of people across the world's borders. She thought about what it meant that 4 other officers had cleared Varro at other airports. She thought about this not as a criticism of those officers, but as a data point, a piece of information about the relationship between volume and attention, about what happened when the routine nature of work produced a kind of efficiency that was also a kind of blindness, about the specific cost of processing things rather than reading them. She had been lucky, in a way, to have come to the work with the disposition that she had, the disposition of someone who found the pattern behind the pattern as interesting as the pattern itself, who had spent 8 years finding it interesting rather than developing the professional fatigue that made interesting things ordinary.
That disposition was not guaranteed. It required maintenance, the same way any discipline required maintenance, and she had maintained it because the work rewarded the maintaining of it. Or at least, she had always found it rewarding, which she understood was not the same thing as its being objectively rewarding, but which had produced the same practical result. She had stopped one man at one desk on one Friday evening.
She had done it because something was wrong, and her job was to find out what. She had found out what, and the what had turned out to be larger than anything she could have anticipated. And she was now walking through Terminal 5 at midnight with the man at the center of the larger thing. And she was paying attention to all of it, to him, to the space around them, to the way the airport sounded at the end of the day when the volume was low, to the specific, particular fact of a situation she had not planned for and was navigating with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. She noticed that he walked at a pace that matched hers without appearing to calculate it. She noticed that he had not attempted to touch her arm or her shoulder in the way that some people did when they were attempting to steer a companion. He simply moved alongside her, at the same pace, occupying his own space without colonizing hers. She noticed that he was, for a man whose entire conversation had been about something enormous and irreversible, very quiet in his body. Not the quietness of suppression, the quietness of someone who was paying attention. She paid attention to this. She had stopped one man at one desk on one Friday evening. She had done it because something was wrong, and her job was to find out what. She had found out what, and the what had turned out to be considerably larger than any individual evening of passport control, and the man walking beside her through Terminal 5 was the center of the considerably larger thing, and she did not know yet what she was going to do with any of that. She knew how to pay attention. She knew how to notice what was wrong before she could explain why. She would pay attention. She would notice. She thought about what he had said, that the people who felt wrong before they could explain why were the people paying attention at a level that most people were not. She turned this over the way she turned most things over, not emotionally, but analytically, checking it against her experience, looking for the places where it held and the places where it didn't. It held, mostly.
The exceptions were the times she had been wrong. The 11 instances in 8 years where something had felt wrong and she had stopped someone and found nothing, and the person had gone on their way with the specific, justified irritation of someone who had been inconvenienced without cause. She had filed each of those instances carefully, had thought about them honestly, had tried to understand what she had read incorrectly and why. She had not concluded from them that the feeling was unreliable. She had concluded from them that the feeling was information, and that information was sometimes incomplete, and that incomplete information, processed carefully, was still the best available tool for the kind of reading she did. 11 wrong in 8 years. Hundreds of thousands of interactions. She was comfortable with the ratio. She was comfortable with the ratio not because she had stopped caring about the 11, but because she had understood, through the 8 years of sustained attention that had produced both the accurate calls and the wrong ones, that the goal was not to be perfect, but to be as accurate as she could be while continuing to work at the pace the work required, and that the only way to sustain that accuracy over time was to maintain the quality of attention that made it possible in the first place. This was, she thought, not so different from what she had watched in Lorenzo Falcone's face throughout the conversation. The specific quality of a man who was maintaining the quality of attention that had built what he had built, even in the aftermath of a betrayal that had come from inside the thing he had built, and that had cost him something she could see he was still in the process of accounting for. Paying attention did not protect you from everything. It protected you from some things. It gave you the information you needed to navigate the rest.